brief introduction about David, and then I'll ask him questions, and we'll go from there. We'll certainly leave time at the end for questions from the audience. David has significant experience litigating First Amendment issues in state and federal court, both at the trial and appellate levels. He's one of the country's leading advocates for freedom of expression in the arts. Before joining the EFF, David was the executive director for the First Amendment Project. He also practiced law at the firms of Bryan Cave and Hancock, Rothert, and Bunshaw. He was the co-founding director of the Internet Free Expression Alliance. He has served on the Freedom of Information Committee for the Northern California Society for Professional Journalists. He's currently on the steering committee for the Free Expression Network and the governing committee of the ABA's Forum on Communications Law, among other leadership roles in other organizations. David also is an adjunct professor at the University of San Francisco School of Law, where he teaches classes in the First Amendment and media law. And he's an instructor in the journalism department at San Francisco State University. So a round of applause for David for coming. So David had also invited people to tweet him questions before today's talk, and he did receive several different topics. I'll ask him those questions, and towards the end, we'll have time for your questions. The first topic is fake news. So fake news is an incorrect term.
Yeah, we hate that term.
Neither David nor I use that term. It's one that nonetheless has captured widespread attention of other folks. Today, for example, the New York Times published a report about Sinclair Broadcasting Group, the country's largest broadcaster, which owns 193 television stations. The Times reported that Sinclair required local broadcasters to recite the same speech regarding the sharing of biased and false news on social media. Last month, we learned that Cambridge Analytica harvested data on 50 million Facebook users to target American voters during the 2016 presidential election, and those are just two examples of the concept of fake news. So, David, some questions for you. How do you define fake news? Do you see it as a problem for democracy? And if it is a problem, is it one that requires or is capable of a legal solution?
Okay, all good questions. And I should say that one of the reasons we don't like the term, we people who work in this area, is because I think it means, at least has potential to mean different things to different people. And so a lot of times you'll having discussions about it, you realize you're actually talking about completely different things. So as far as I see it, people use the term to mean at least three different things. One is like parody news sites. Things that are unabashedly fake, like The Onion or The Daily Current, or things like that, that are you're just intended to be humorous or political commentary, but are purposefully parodic. And that's probably the easy one to take out of the debate. But I think what's harder is that the term also gets used to talk about mistakes that get made by journalists. And you know, I've never been a journalist myself. I've actually taught in a journalism department for almost 20 years now. And as a journalism instructor, we just have not perfected the training that makes someone a mistake-free journalist. Maybe we'll get to it sometime soon. But you know, journalists, like every other human being, are going to make mistakes. And really what we look for is when journalists do make mistakes is what you do afterwards. After you realize you've made a mistake, is it retracted, or do you have some type of practices to address it? But I think it's really dangerous dangerous and counterproductive to include mistakes in the discussion of fake news, because mistakes are just mistakes that people make. These are people who aren't intending to misinform, but who made a mistake, and hopefully there's some type of correction process involved. And I say this, I know this seems like a sort of, maybe for some of you think this is an easy thing to sort of, we're clearly not talking about that, but I recently did a panel on fake news. And I played the role, so the way this panel was set up was that there was someone who was an expert on memetic warfare. I know what that is. And then there's someone who was doing the First Amendment line. And I was sort of this person who was supposed to be questioning both of them and a few other panelists. And the First Amendment person started like going off about like Dan Rather and and the George W. Bush documents and things like this. And I was like, that's not fake news. That was the guy made a mistake. It was a bad mistake. He got fired for it and everything. But I don't understand. You know, to me, that wasn't the example of the problem we're talking about. We generally talk about now. And that leads to the third category, which is propaganda. which is sort of purposefully false information that is put out there. It's known to be false, but it's put out there with the intention that people believe it to be true. And that's we used to just call that propaganda, and now we're using the term fake news, which is a concerning term for a few different reasons that I can get to later. I do want to say though that it's even difficult sometimes to put things into one of those three boxes, into the parody, the mistakes, or the propaganda box. And I think the Comet Pizza his story is actually an interesting one because it started as propaganda, but then I think actually moved very quickly into the level of mistake. So as far as we can tell, so everyone know the Pizza Gate? Okay, good. Okay, so as far as we know, this was, after John Podesta's emails were leaked by WikiLeaks in the run-up to the election, and he had mentioned going to Comet Pizza. There was an email mentioned there. There was started on a subreddit, maybe even a subreddit. This rumor that he goes to Comet Pizza and he goes there because of a trafficking ring there or something like that. And then there was a bunch of comments and sort of building on the story on there, and no one saw it, except apparently from some months later, some journalists in Turkey saw it, and then started reporting on it as if it was true. And then a lot of the what you consider to be like right-wing media, and I mean that descriptively, not dismissively, picked up and reported using the Turkish news agency as their source. So so it's hard to where do you put something like that? There actually were people reporting it saying they were sourcing it from another news agency, which is not typically an awful thing. We'd like our journalists to have at least two sources. But relying on another news entity, even a foreign one, is not like an awful journalistic practice. And yet it was sort of planted, it seems with the intention to be false, although if you sort of go back and read those subreddit, it looked like they might have just been joking. So even it's hard to put things in those three boxes. So I've forgotten what the original.
Well, let me ask you. So you raised three different types of fake news if you
Yeah.
want to categorize it. One is mistakes, and we have a law for that. It's defamation law, right? And so if you're talking about public figures or matters of public concern, you have to prove actual malice. So one could say if we're talking about mistakes in fake news, we have a legal solution already.
Right, and the legal solution is we basically say we will protect everything but the purposeful one.
And we know that parody is generally protected. We can look at the Hustler versus Falwell case for parody. What about propaganda? I think this is one of the more complicated questions here, right? So should there be legal solutions to propaganda, or should there be non-legal solutions to fake propaganda?
Yeah. So the law on lying, legal protection for lying under U.S. law is actually quite I think is actually quite limited. So to me the allowing for a tort of defamation for purposeful false statement, to me, is actually more the exception. And I think false statements are generally protected. This isn't a question that the U.S. Supreme Court has answered definitively. We had in the U.S. versus Alvarez case, in the Stolen Valor Act case. This was the federal law that made it a crime to lie about having received a military honor. And that the Supreme Court struck that law down as unconstitutional, saying that even false statements are going to be protected, and there's various reasons why. And the court said, and the real defect in that law was that there was no harm requirement, and that perhaps if a law had said you could be liable for damages or causing harm with a false statement, that would be a different situation. It's unclear what we mean by harm, if that has to be a financial harm, like from a fraud situation, or if it could be some other type of harm. I don't think the court was clear on that. But I really think beyond like fraud, especially like commercial fraud and false advertising and perjury and defamation, I actually think that falsity is largely protected by the First Amendment.
So does the EFF do any work or take any position on fake news?
Well, fortunately, we haven't had to take a position on it because no one has asked us to, but we're highly skeptical of any, the question I get a lot is, well, how can we regulate these media? And my answer is you can't. I don't even think it's worth trying. I can't think of a way of regulating, a way of regulating media that would be consistent with the First Amendment, outside of maybe broadcast radio and television, which is such an obscure thing that many of you here may have experienced your whole life without not even knowing what broadcast radio and television is. So I don't think it is possible to regulate versus, I think it's not possible to regulate online media specifically regarding propaganda.
Well, let me turn to another subject I know that the EFF does work on, which is Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act and the recently passed FOSTA bill. So 2 weeks ago, Congress passed a bill known as FOSTA. It's a bill intended to allow states and victims to fight online sex trafficking. The bill seeks to do this by limiting the immunity provided to online service providers under the 1996 Act, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. So first, for folks that might not be familiar with it, what is Section 230? And then secondly, what are your thoughts on FOSTA that limits the immunity provided by Section 230?
Yeah, so Section 230, basically what we have under US law is that online intermediaries enjoy an immunity, a legal immunity for liability that would otherwise arise because of content that's published on their platforms. So the way the law is phrased is that they're not treated as publishers. That's actually a common law distinction. The significance of it treating as a publisher. The common law meant you could be liable for any liable in tort for anything that is said. So under common law, for example, if you're a bookseller and there is a defamatory statement in a book that you were selling, you could be you are considered a publisher of that book. And then common law also made a distinction between sort of what publishers and distributors, publishers being involved sort of in creating the content, and distributors just sort of being pass-throughs of the content. And distributors could only be liable if they actually had knowledge, knew of the offending content. So what Section 230 says is that online intermediaries aren't being treated like publishers. These are like publishers or the subset of publishers called distributors. And so essentially saying that what it was anticipating was that online publishers you could not scale publication liability on the internet because there's just way too much. Is that our internet was built, the way it developed, the architecture developed was based on intermediaries providing platforms that then everybody could use. And if these platforms would be responsible for every piece of content that was posted through them, if they could bear liability for that, then platforms would not exist because the threat of legal liability would be too great. So Section 230 says, okay, you have immunity for all content that's posted by others, stuff you did not create yourself on your platform. So what FOSTA has done, and there's some exceptions to Section 230. The two big ones are for intellectual property. There's a separate system for copyright violations, which is a notice and takedown system, and then for violations of federal criminal law. So those were the two existing exceptions to Section 230. And so what Congress just passed, the president's not actually signed it yet. I don't know if that's purposeful or not, is this bill FOSTA. And I think FOSTA is, although a well-intentioned bill, because child trafficking is an awful thing, it's an awful bill. It's really bad. And it's bad because it does way more than address child trafficking. What was passed is more of just against sexual content on the internet. So it basically does three things. It expands federal criminal law in two important ways. One, we had existing federal criminal law that made it illegal to advertise children, minors for sexual services. That was already illegal under the SAFE Act, which was passed 4 years ago. And what FOSTA expanded that law by saying not just advertising, but participating in it. But you were still liable if you could participate in a venture. Regarding human trafficking, regarding sort of forced sexual services. And participative adventure includes assisting, supporting, or facilitating. So anyone who could be seen as assisting, supporting, or facilitating a venture that did that. And I'll get back to some bad applications of that. The second way it expanded federal criminal law is expanded the Mann Act. So do you guys still learn about the Mann Act, like in criminal law, like the second class you take? So the Mann Act is the federal law that says you can't physically transport minors across state lines for sex. And what this bill has done is expanded. It says that it's not just physically transporting across state lines, it's using any mode of interstate commerce, specifically the internet, for sexual service, for sexual services. Which raises a real problem when a sexual service is legal in one state but illegal in another state. So state laws vary greatly on what extent massage can be sexual, what sex therapy and sex surrogacy, those are legal. Some states prostitution is legal, some states escorts are regulated to a different extent. Some states live performance, cams and things like that are regulated differently. So all these things that might be legal in one place but illegal in another, the mere fact that they're on the internet is now captured within the Mann Act. There is a affirmative defense in there for, well, if it's legal in the place where you actually only offer the service. But as we know, affirmative defenses don't do a whole lot when you're trying to buy insurance. And then the third thing that Sesta Foster did was that because it expanded federal criminal law, those federal crimes were now outside of Section 230. But in addition, this law said that it also allowed for state criminal prosecutions and, really importantly, civil suits that mirror these federal prohibitions. The reason why this was so important to the advocates of the bill is because after the SAFE Act was passed, it said it made it illegal to actually advertise for minors and sexual services online. There were no federal prosecutions. It just wasn't a priority of the Department of Justice or federal prosecutors. But state prosecutors and civil litigants really wanted to be in on this. And so this has expanded where these challenges can arise greatly. And so it's just the prospect of greater legal liability. Even if you think you haven't done anything wrong, just your exposure to potential litigation is much greater now.
So assuming that the president signs FOSTA and it becomes enacted into law, what are the next steps to challenge it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think the law is unconstitutional. I think it might have been possible to write a law that was really geared specifically towards child trafficking, but I think there's all sorts of applications to this law that I think are unconstitutional. And let me just give you one example. So a lot of public health and advocacy organizations that work around the sex work community, so they either support or advocate for sex workers, or they understand that, or they, even if they don't approve of sex work or advocate for sex work, they understand that sex workers face unique public health, have unique public health needs. One of their most effective ways of actually reaching this audience is to advertise their own services on sites that are platforms for sex work. And so their question is, if they advertise on a site that they know there's illegal sex work happening on, but their advertisement is, hey, sex worker, here's some medical services are available, here's public health information, or we want to try and get you out of this. Like, if you're trying to get out of this, any type of advocacy work they're trying to do, if they're advertising as one of those sites, is that participating in a venture? Is that, because they're advertising, they're paying to place ads on the site, is that assisting, supporting, or facilitating that site that is being used? So I think that this law is actually, and there have been many advocates against child trafficking who come out and say, well, this law is actually going to do more harm than good. It's really, it equates legal sex work with illegal sex work. It's not limited, it's really not limited to sort of minors, except in one way, but goes much broader than that. So I think it's unconstitutional. Whether it can be challenged pre-enforcement, I think, is a difficult thing. I don't know how you've covered standing to bring pre-enforcement lawsuits. The Supreme Court has really scaled back on who is standing to bring such lawsuits in recent years. So I don't know whether we'll see a pre-enforcement challenge or whether the first challenge will all actually come on someone challenging the constitutionality as a defense to a prosecution or a civil claim.
Is this something that you would think that a strict scrutiny challenge would be worthwhile?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think I think it's a content-based law, so I think it's going to have to satisfy strict scrutiny, and I don't think it can. So I think that will be the legal argument. That will be the legal argument that's made. Certainly to the federal criminal law expansion, I think you can make the same argument to the Section 230, to the additional carve-outs there as well. But I don't think it's going to, it could satisfy strict scrutiny.
So another question that was raised in the tweets to David were border searches on electronic devices. In September 2017, the EFF and the ACLU filed a lawsuit against the federal government on behalf of 11 travelers whose smartphones and other electronic devices were searched without a warrant at the United States border. That case is Al-Assad versus Nielsen, and that's filed in the district court in Massachusetts. Just last month, the 11th Circuit held in a 2-to-1 decision that border agents did not need a warrant before conducting a forensic search of a traveler's cell phone. The dissent, however, concluded that courts should rethink the border search exception to the Fourth Amendment because of the significant privacy interests that people have in their electronic devices. That case is U.S. versus Vergara. So, David, could you tell us a little bit about the EFF's work on the border search issue?
Yeah, so as Joe said, we've filed a lawsuit. We're co-counseling with the ACLU. It's in the district court in Massachusetts. And we have, I believe there are 7 plaintiffs, each of whom are U.S. persons. I think 5 are U.S. citizens and 2 are legal permanent residents who had their devices searched as they re-entered the country, and without any probable cause. And so we believe that's unconstitutional. We believe that we would like there to be a probable cause standard. We think at a minimum there should be a reasonable suspicion standard at the border, so that they have to at least think you've done something wrong. And that's the way the case has been litigated. It has been fully briefed on motion to dismiss, which is what we expected, and the hearing is next month. So, and I'm not sure when we'll have a decision after that. I think no matter what happens, it will go up to the First Circuit. And I remain hopeful that this is something I think an area just really going to have to crack away at. I think one of the things that's important is when we filed the case, we were challenging both physical searches of the devices as well as by forensic searches. We usually mean cloud searches. So you have 2 ways. Essentially your device is a portal to information in 2 ways, right? One, there's the information that's physically stored on your device. And then there's information being obtained through your device that's actually stored in the cloud or on a server somewhere that's not being held in your hand. And after we filed the lawsuit, the Department of Homeland Security issued a policy statement that said that they were not going to do cloud searches without probable cause. 11th Circuit said they don't have to, but they've still said that that's at least their voluntary thing. So our case for the time being is really just about physically searching the device.
So let me ask you the question, and I think I have this law right. So the Supreme Court has held that probable cause is not required for border searches, but reasonable suspicion is.
No, they've said that nothing is required for physical searches at the border. The Supreme Court has said that no level of suspicion is required at all.
And so is EFF, or are you making the case that we should make a distinction at the border between my suitcase and my phone, and why?
We are, and this is really a distinction that we think is the Supreme Court has already made in other contexts, in the Jones and in the Riley cases, where they did say that, so if not at the border, the Supreme Court has said that you can't treat someone's phone like a pack of cigarettes. Right, so if you are if there's a search instant to an arrest, for example, You could actually physically open up the pack of cigarettes to make sure it's just cigarettes and doesn't contain a bomb or a knife or something dangerous in it like that. But the Supreme Court said with a telephone, you can't actually, just because you have the legitimate ability to possess the phone momentarily, you actually can't search it without a warrant. And so we're just saying that distinction that's already been made between devices that hold a tremendous amount of data and other physical objects, that distinction should be made at the border as well. So that even though the Supreme Court before has said no level of suspicion is required for physical searches at the border, that there should be a separate rule for devices, just because they contain such a tremendous amount of information about people.
So segueing from this conversation about border searches of electronic devices, I'd like to talk a little bit more about government surveillance. So the 2008 FISA Amendments Act has a provision in there called Section 702. David, what is Section 702? What does it allow the government to do, and why does the EFF view Section 702 as a problematic law?
Yeah, well, Section 702 is a spying law. It's a law that allows the government to spy, and it's a law that allows the government to spy in secret as well, because it allows them to obtain orders to spy through the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, which is a court that does not hold public proceedings and has more transparency requirements than it used to have, but still it can largely operate in secret. The government operates two programs, as far as we know, under Section 702. One which used to be called PRISM, but which is now called Downstream. And this allowed the government to just request from internet companies, sort of the big ones, just information about all communications involving non-U.S. persons. It only had to be one-way non-U.S. persons, so a non-U.S. person communicating with U.S. persons, all that stuff would still get swept up. The other program, called Upstream, actually allowed, what the government did under Upstream is that they would, at least facilitated major communications companies, the ones that operate the fiber optic networks, which is almost exclusively AT&T in this country. So the ones who operate the physical infrastructure, it actually either required them or at least facilitated them actually making taking a copy of the internet traffic as it passed through their communications hubs. So they had a fiber optic splitter installed, and so the internet traffic would go where it was supposed to go, and the copy would actually go where it could be analyzed and used for intelligence gathering purposes. Again, they're only supposed to use that to get information about non-U.S. persons. But the government has admitted to a practice they call incidental collection. I don't like that term because it makes it seem like it's a mistake or unintended. Incidental collection is very intended. And this actually, where they are purposely collecting information about U.S. persons, that just gets caught up when they're collecting information about foreign people. It's not just because they don't have a technological way of separating it out. It's because they actually they use this program as a way of getting information about U.S. persons, because they think this might have some national security purpose. And so we in the advocacy community call these backdoor searches. They call it, government calls it incidental collection. And essentially, when 702 was just up for reauthorization, and they passed a new authorization, and one of the things it did was actually make most of these backdoor searches specifically authorized by statute. They hadn't been authorized before, were subject to legal challenges, and they said, well, now they at least have statutory authorization to them. The other thing you should know is that once the government has it, there's no requirement that it actually even stay within Department of Homeland Security and be used for anti-terrorism purposes. It can be, and we know that it gets used by the FBI just for law enforcement purposes, and probably even gets shared with local law enforcement as well.
Sticking on this concept of spying and surveillance, let's talk about drones.
Okay.
So drones are increasingly used by both public and private actors. A couple questions are, what should legislators do to protect privacy invasion caused by drones? And also, are there unique concerns when the drones are used by journalists?
Yeah, and let me answer both questions in the same way, is that this is, I think, it's a really tough issue, and it's one that we have a lot of internal debate in our office about, because there is drones are definitely privacy invasive, but they're also really, really great at gathering information that pertains to a matter of public interest. And so, and you can definitely have a situation where those two really important, and I think, to me, both of those legal rights sort of have a First Amendment origin to them, or at least a First Amendment gloss to them. And you can definitely see how they could be in conflict here. So, so this is now my personal statements and not EFF's position on this. But I do think that, I don't think it's, I think any regulation of journalistic uses or news gathering uses of drones, I think is going to be very difficult, as we subject to very strong First Amendment protections. And so I do think in regulating this area, there is a distinction is going to have to be made between news gathering purposes, gathering information that pertains to a matter of public interest, and other purposes. And that, I think it's going to be very difficult to regulate the former, and unwise to regulate the former. And so if there's some way of craft the regulation, only regulate the latter, then I think that would be possible. And then, of course, there's all the things the Federal Aviation Administration needs to regulate, just in terms of use. We don't want drones like, hitting airplanes and things like that. But in terms of content regulation, I think there's going to have to be a strict separation between uses that are at least intended to obtain information that's a matter of public interest.
Based on something you said, let me step back from the legal questions and ask you a little bit about how the EFF operates. So you mentioned on the drone issue that there's internal debate on this. How does the EFF work through these issues, and are there issues that there's so much internal debate that you, as an organization, have to say, we just can't get involved in this because we can't agree on it?
Yeah, so so there's things, it's not like we agree on everything. I mean, we have 84 people now, and so it would, and people work there because they sort of buy into the mission. But it's, there are sometimes, there are a lot of times that we really hash out issues. Like we realize we need to have an organizational position on something. And we spend a lot of time really figuring out what that's going to be, and listening to people and giving really every single person in the organization an opportunity to be heard about it. And that's a really inefficient process, but I think we usually end up in a really good place because of it. There are some times where we don't agree, and usually we're okay with that as long as we're not required to take a position. And I think drones is probably an example of that. So at EFF we have two teams of lawyers whose purpose is to do impact litigation. One team works on intellectual property issues, mostly fair use copyright and freedom to innovate patent law type stuff. And then we have the team of civil liberties lawyers that work on free speech and privacy issues. And some of us have sort of come to that group from a free speech background, like me, and others have come to that group from a privacy background. And sometimes those two perspectives actually come into clash. And I think drones is an example where, I think in those situations we do tend to fall back on the matter of public interest distinction, in where we can agree.
Well, based on that, on copyright, let's talk about that for a moment. So,
with the caveat that I actually don't work on the copyright issues, but I'll do the best I can.
So just an overview of some of the copyright issues that the EFF is working on now.
Yeah. So, we do a lot of fair use work, and online fair use work. That's probably the vast amount of copyright work we do. We also do some work challenging Section 1201 of the Copyright Act. And
what is that?
Yeah, so again, no follow-up questions on this, okay? But Section 1201 essentially is the anti-circumvention provisions that say that it is a violation of copyright to circumvent copyright, digital rights management, copyright protection systems. And so this so we have two things going on. One, we think Section 1201 is unconstitutional. We think it violates the First Amendment. And so we have an ongoing case about that, and in which our two plaintiffs are academic researchers and security researchers. Okay, and the idea being that sometimes in order to make security and anti-circumvention, to make them stronger, you actually need to be able to pick them apart, have independent people pick them apart and scrutinize them. But there's also a ton of other situations where there's really good policy reasons why people should actually be allowed to circumvent copyright protection. And right now, the Copyright Office has a system where you can seek exemptions from Section 1201. So, for example, academic research is one that always gets sought and usually gets granted. But there's other things, like if you're someone who likes to tinker with your car and you want to be able to, and some cars are now being made tinker-proof because the computers are sort of wrapped in this copyright protection. And so whether you can tinker with your own car or something that in the last several rounds of exemption, that exemption has been rejected. One where the exemption was just granted for the first time, so there's a new round of exemptions coming up, and it happens every 2 years, was for medical devices, the idea that, like, if you have like a pacemaker in your body keeping you alive and you actually want to be able to control what that thing does, well, it used to be that you were violating copyright if you wanted to play around with that, and they did grant the exemption for medical devices the last time. I'm assuming they'll renew it, but it's not a guarantee. It's that's strongly opposed by medical device manufacturers, and so none of these things are automatic.
All right, so I want to ask one more question and then open it up to the audience for questions. Oftentimes, both I teach at the undergrad and the law school level, and I often have students come up and ask me, I'm interested in the First Amendment, I'm interested in media law, how do I develop a career in this area? And so we're looking for your words of wisdom on that path.
As I told Joe before, I wish I had the secret formula, right? And I don't have it. I mean, my path, I don't think was a typical one. Most of the people I know who practice sort of media law or have First Amendment practices that are outside of the adult entertainment industry are former journalists and who worked with lawyers when they were practicing journalists and sort of got into it that way. I didn't do that. I was an environmental scientist before I went to law school, and went to law school to be an environmental lawyer, and then didn't like my environmental law class, but loved my First Amendment class, and so made a turn, and then got out, and I was like, how do I get a job, right? And so, but I was fortunate that I ended up at a firm that just was general practice, and I had to do a lot of insurance defense stuff, but when there was a free speech issue, they let me work on it. And then ultimately I transitioned into the public interest area and started working for nonprofit organizations and was able to work sort of exclusively on free speech issues from a public interest perspective. And my general advice I give for all law students, no matter what you want to do, is to try and meet as many people practicing the type of law as you can. Because no matter what level you are, whether you're a new law student or whether you're someone who's been practicing law for 20 years, the surest way you're ever going to get a job, or volunteer opportunity or anything, is through personal connections. And so whether it's if any opportunity you have to be involved in a professional, either an ABA group or any other type of local professional organization, like, you just have to take advantage of that stuff. I think you have to assume that you're going to get a job in your field from people who are currently in the field, and you just have to find a way of getting to know them either on a personal level or a professional level or what. So anytime those opportunities are available, I think you need to take advantage of them.
Thank you, David. So I'd like to open it up, and if anybody has questions, please raise your hand, and we're recording this, so I'd love to bring the microphone to you if you have a question.
You want me to stand up? All right. Hello? I've never used one of these before.
You're doing well.
You talk about fake news,
Yeah.
and you talked about propaganda as something that's false. But what do you do about something that's sort of technically true but deliberately misleading? How do you classify that?
Well, I guess the point I wanted to make was that I don't think we should classify these things. So I don't think there's a legal solution to fake news in the propaganda sense. I do think this to me is one of those classic situations where you get the who decides thing. Who do we want deciding this? Do we want a legal requirement that the platforms decide this, that they can't put any information? And it's not just saying a legal requirement, but if we create liability for them for doing that, like then they're going to take on that responsibility. We certainly don't want the government deciding it. We don't want every case to have to go to a jury. I mean, so how do we do this thing where we actually distinguish between the stuff that is false or not false? I think one of the things that's interesting with this area, as opposed to a lot of other contents of speech that people get upset about, is this is one of the ones, pretty uniquely to me, where it's always somebody else that's making the mistake, right? So I never hear someone say, I read the story and I thought it was true and I did something because I thought it was true. It's always, my neighbor is stupid and you need to protect me from my neighbor making stupid decisions. And so that I think should tell us something about everyone always feels like, well, I knew it was fake, and certainly someone knew it was fake. I think the problem here is really probably not a legal one. It's probably more of a sociological one. And sociologists who have looked at this, there's a great organization called Data and Society that just put out a whole study about this, is saying that when people, when we see on social media, the problem doesn't seem to be like advertisements that are placed on social media, so like fake ads and things like that. It seems to be just the stories that people send to their friends and that they share with their friends. That seems to be the problem. And it also seems that people actually don't even click through and read the stories, right? And that it also seems when people share these things, they don't even necessarily care whether they're true or not, but they are tribal, what sociologists call tribal signaling. They are just saying, look, I'm someone who wants to be associated with this truth. So I don't know that there's a way of legislating that, right? Unless we legislate the way how people want to identify with themselves. So I think these are some of the concerns. The other thing I wanted to mention about why I think fake news is such a dangerous term and why I think this area, even like if you take a step towards regulation here, is really dangerous, or the international ramifications here. So first of all, fake news, as that term has been used as a term to persecute dissidents and government opponents in other parts of the world for many, many, many years. So there was a great report just put out by a bunch of Latin American advocacy organizations, civil liberties organizations, about documenting 50 years of fake news persecution of dissidents in Latin America. So when they hear that term, that's what they think. The government tries to squelch its opposition, and so it says that everything they're publishing criticizes the government is fake news, and these people and their dissidents get thrown in jail. So that's why the term is considered very dangerous to many of us. And you have to look at that in the fact that U.S. internet policy, just because the internet started here in this country, it's not, the internet is certainly international. I remember, I heard 80% of Facebook users are non-US now, right? So it's always silly, it seems we try and exert influence over Facebook when we're a small percentage of the users. But US internet policy still has an outside influence on how other governments regulate the internet. And everything we do in this country to regulate, to try and put some limits on internet freedom, free speech, will be magnified by 100% in a legal regime that's not as respectful of free speech. They'll say, well, the U.S. can do it, and they're really respectful of free speech, and we know that we regulate speech more, so we're going to do what they just did and do it 100 times greater. So that's why we have to be really careful. There are social media, Facebook especially, is used in other countries. Sometimes it's the only way that dissident organizations can get their information to the public. So there was the question.
Hi. Let's say I, as a U.S. citizen, I'm crossing the border tomorrow, and they're asking me to unlock my devices. Do you think that I should comply? And if I don't, what's the worst that could happen?
So it's a really good question, and let me not answer it for you. Okay, but there's a reason why I'm not going to answer it. First of all, I'm going to refer you and anybody who might have that question to a guide that we published, the EFF published, called Device Security at the Borders. We just published this a few months ago, and it was a revision of something we had published 5 years before that. 5 years before that, we'd actually made a recommendation what you do with in that situation. Do you unlock your device? Do you not? But what we realized was that everybody's threat model is completely different. And some people, for some people, it might be a good decision to unlock their device. Other people, it might not be a good decision. And so really what you're doing in answering that question for yourself is what's your personal threat model, right? You know, and you can walk, and our guide helps you walk through this. If you could say no, your device is going to get seized, and you're going to be without your device. So is that good? Is that bad? You know, what's on it? Can you be without it? I mean, these are all the things you have to think about. You know, so then what do you do if you're traveling with a device and you neither want to unlock it or have it seized? Then you have to think about what are you traveling with. You know, maybe you don't travel with devices that have. You know, maybe you get just travel devices, or you wipe wipe a laptop that gets wiped clean when you're traveling. I mean, so our border search guide actually helps walk through that whole decision-making process without making a single one-size-fits-all recommendation.
Could you give a couple examples of threat model just to expand on that term?
What threat model means? Yeah, threat modeling is just looking at your individual situation and deciding where the threats are, which threats you can tolerate, which ones you can't. So everybody has a different threat model, right? Everybody might have, you know, what the information on how sensitive the information is on your device is something that plays into your own threat model, or whether you can be without your device for a few. Usually, we're finding it's taking, you know, about a few months before you get your stuff back if it gets seized.
So if you're Glenn Greenwald with confidential sources and national security information, your threat model might be high.
Yeah. I mean, our internal policy at EFF is that we have a list of countries that when you travel to, you can't take any device that connects to EDFF server with you. And we have like a bunch of old laptops that have been wiped clean, and we have ways that what you do when you get there so that you connect remotely. But so you don't want anything that's going to actually store any data on your. And that's how we do it, because there are certain places where the threat model is very high for EFF employees, and I think the threat model is high everywhere. And so I think many journalistic organizations now give people blank devices when they travel.
Other questions?
Thank you. Do you foresee any change in U.S. law regarding incitement as the U.S. government and other governments throughout the world deal with issues of terrorist recruitment and how to deal with that kind of speech online?
Yeah. So, no, I don't foresee any changes. And maybe that's aspirational because because I like our incitement doctrine. I like that it's so limited, that it protects so much speech. And I don't see a path for it being limited at all. So again, just the incitement doctrine, which has been U.S. law essentially since 1969 in the Brandenburg versus Ohio decision, is going to require there be no liability for speech can't be punished because it has the capacity to cause other people to do harmful things, unless it is intended and directed at causing imminent, serious, lawless misconduct. Did I just get that whole thing right? Okay. So imminent, serious, lawless misconduct and serious misconduct, and that's essentially that concept was introduced to the law in 1929 and sort of became U.S. law in 1969, is now firmly embedded as U.S. law. And so I don't see that changing. I think the pressure you get is from international legal systems. Most sort of comparable international legal systems have a similar incitement doctrine. The imminence requirement is not as strict. But the big difference is that they include within incitement to hatred and oppression. And so I think if there's pressure, like, would it be from other international legal systems there? For better or for worse, I just don't think those are the type of areas that the U.S. legal system, that people who generally have an interest in restricting speech rights care about right now. So.
Hi, thanks for coming. So I have a two-part question. So the first is, to what extent are bots considered under the First Amendment? Like, if I went around and I created a program that posted things, is that still considered my speech, or is there any sort of clarification between that? And then the second part is, what if it was artificially intelligent, it was able to adapt, and it began posting outside of my original intentions of what I wanted it to do? To what extent am I considered liable to that? Thank you.
Okay, let me do the easy one first. So, bots, at least according right now, like bots cannot exist without a human sort of creating them and programming them. So to me, that's a person. So when a bot speaks, that's a person speaking. So I think it's the creator's speech, and I think so. So I think it goes from there. I sort of also just, and I think you all probably know this looking at this crowd, but I always like to push back on the idea, and I don't think you were doing this, but not all bots are bad, right? In fact, most bots are really great and efficient, and you get stuff in your Twitter feed that because you didn't know was there. So the idea that something happens automatically is not a bad thing. I think where we've tended to, they tend to get attacked right now is that bots that pretend to be people. They're just fake people pretending to be people. So, but to me, it's the speech of the creator. AI, I think, and especially with deep learning, where you think that at least there's some capacity that some machine will start functioning beyond what its human creators did. I think at least where we are right now, to me, it's the same rule. That it's still the creators programming something to speak and express itself in some way, even if it goes beyond what they originally did. But I recognize that might not be true in the future, and I don't know what the solution is. It's something we are thinking about a great deal, but my guess is it's going to be addressed sort of in a highly specific context by context basis. Sorry for not having a better answer.
The recent Facebook data breach, I feel like the public is becoming a lot more aware.
Wasn't a breach. Go ahead.
Right, I feel like the public is becoming a lot more aware of big data and what these companies are actually doing with them. So, do you see any future implications of big data on First Amendment, on free speech?
I don't know if I see implications on it on free speech. I'm not sure that there's a legal way of dealing with it. I think the implication could be greater, just could be what sort of practice individual companies' practices are. So a lot of the consumer data privacy issues we don't deal with at EFF as lawyers. I mean, they don't raise constitutional issues, which tends to be the thing that we do impact litigation around. And we tend to address them in terms of pressuring companies to adopt good practices. And so we encourage companies to allow for data portability, to be incredibly transparent, to have terms of service that are clear, to allow people, to really encourage opt-in systems when possible instead of opt-out systems, and things like that. So I don't know if it's going to have legal ramifications. I do think we might get, so for example, in California last year we had a data privacy bill that did not pass, but would have made a lot of these practices, would have required a lot of the practices I just talked about. So I think there might be more, there might be some impetus for that legislation in states now.
Other questions?
It's whether the recording can hear you. That's the problem. So yeah.
I was gonna ask. I always ask people who kind of have a take on the First Amendment. What's your kind of stand on ballot selfies? Whether they should be regulated, whether it's kind of up to the person.
I think it's a great question. I don't see that. I'm highly skeptical that any of the regulation regarding speech at the ballot, I think, is of questionable constitutionality. Not even
even recognized there was a Supreme Court case that said that at least one specific application was constitutional. I don't see why ballot selfies, why laws restricting ballot selfies that's constitutionally protected speech, as far as I'm concerned. I don't see that. I don't think a law would be consistent with the First Amendment. Again, we haven't had the only challenges so far have said the same thing. They've lower court challenges. But I think that if you look at Burson versus Freeman, which is the Supreme Court, where the case in which the Supreme Court upheld the Tennessee law that said there could be no campaigning for a candidate within 100 feet of a polling place. I think if you look at the highly specific reasons in that case where the court said that that law satisfied strict scrutiny, and it really was the first Supreme Court case actually where they said strict scrutiny didn't kill a law. I think it's really hard to say that any of the reasons there transport to ballot selfies. I mean, the law was all about other people intimidating people. It was, people being pressured to vote one way when they're actually at the polling place. And I don't think that any of those policies, and I don't think that case holds up very well also. But I don't think that even if you think that it's a very well-reasoned case, I don't think that any of the policies there apply to ballot selfies. I think the concerns are much more attenuated for voter intimidation, voter influence, that that will encourage people to sell their votes and things like that.
Other questions?
Thank you. This kind of just continues the discussion relating to the ballot selfies.
Yeah.
I'm curious what your thoughts are with the idea that the ballot box is maybe not a place of where you should have freedom of expression due to time, place, manner restrictions, that it's the act of your liberties are the act of voting, therefore you don't need to be speaking. Where do you think that there should be a line drawn between the time, place, manner restrictions often put on polling places, whether it's wearing political speech like a button, or it's something like having the act of a selfie, should speech be in a place where you have to just vote?
Yeah. So, so first off, I think that it's really difficult to look at the restrictions that are placed on speech at polling places in terms of time, place, and matter restrictions. Because when we typically talk about time, place, and matter restrictions, we're talking about content-neutral provisions. And these things are almost never, ever content-neutral. They're always about, no, you can't campaign, you can't advocate for a candidate, you can't do all those things. I think that it's going to be a content-based restriction. It's going to have to satisfy First Amendment strict scrutiny. I think there's some things that probably could satisfy strict scrutiny in terms of sort of active campaigning in a polling place, how that could be very intimidating to somebody and interfere with someone's constitutional right to vote. But I think the things like wearing a T-shirt or button, I think it's really hard to make. It's really hard to justify restrictions like that under strict scrutiny. And I think 100 feet is, when you read Burson versus Freeman, 100 feet seems, they admit it's sort of a random number, but they say you don't need to be surgically precise about it. But it actually seems to be quite far from a polling place. That being said, I've only once in my life, I think, really have had to vote at a place where I thought people could be easily intimidated at the polling place, and so and that one time I realized how when you haven't experienced that it's hard to appreciate how awful the pressure can be and how intimidating it can be. And so I think it is possible to sort of narrowly tailor a restriction in a way that satisfies strict scrutiny, but I do think it's going to have to consider all of those factors.
David, in our last couple of minutes here, I have two questions for you. Sure. So one, a very practical one. So for our students that are graduating from law school soon, they might end up in general practice, but they have an interest like you to be involved in the First Amendment. Does the EFF provide any opportunities to get involved with litigation?
Well, we do, actually, yeah. So, so we have the main thing we do is that we have a list of cooperating attorneys to which we receive probably 40 requests for assistance a day on average, and some days are much greater, and after the Facebook news, for example, it was many more than 40. and most of the, we only do impact litigation ourselves, so we only do litigation that's going to have a sort of that its impact is going to be greatly magnified from just the participants. So, but there's a lot of other worthy things that come in that we don't do, and we tend to refer these out to a list of cooperating attorneys. Many of those are pro bono opportunities, but some of those, the occasional ones, are paying. Some of those are, I just want to talk to someone on the phone for 30 minutes, and some of them are, I need someone to litigate this case for me, and can you commit to 5 years of litigation? And so they completely range in scale and subject matter. But that's an open list. Someone can get on it by emailing info@eff.org, and that information's on our website as well. And that's what we provide. There are some other organizations that maintain similar lists as well, and you should, your most local ACLU chapters have similar lists. They tend to screen them a little bit more, and some other First Amendment organizations. Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, and Student Press Law Center are just 2 examples, the ones I know have similar lists.
And then the last final question here is, one of your co-founders passed away recently, John Perry Barlow. He's a hero of mine for a couple reasons. Could you share a brief thought or story about John Barlow?
Oh, man. So do everyone understand the John Perry Barlow thing? So EFF was founded by 3 or 4 people, depending on which story you hear. And so one was Mitch Kapoor, who was the founder of Lotus Systems, which might not be significant to you, but like one of the big first huge players in the internet. Spreadsheets. They made spreadsheets. There weren't spreadsheets before Lotus. Another one was I think we can say now, it used to be sort of a secret, but it's not anymore. Steve Wozniak was one of the also original founders as well, from one of the founders of Apple. A gentleman named John Gilmore, who was like employee number 3 at Netscape, but had been involved in sort of internet stuff for a while. And then the fourth was John Perry Barlow, who at that time, or at least previous to that, was mostly known as what he always used to say, lyricist number 2 for the Grateful Dead. He wasn't Robert Hunter, who was lyricist number 1, but he was lyricist number 2, but wrote some great songs. Estimated Prophet, Cassidy, or your other favorite.
I could go on, but go ahead.
Yeah. So anyway, but he had become involved in sort of internet governance things through some weird circumstances, just by sort of attending these meetings with other thought leaders, and one of the things he had done was had written this Internet Declaration of Independence, or Declaration of Independence of the Internet, of cyberspace, which was a purely aspirational thing about that the internet has this capacity to sort of be this thing that can't be governed, that can't be controlled by any international legal system. This very sort of utopian ideal of the internet, but that's why he was sort of brought in as one of the founders of this thing. And up until his death a few weeks ago, he was very much involved in the day-to-day of the organization. He still was in the office all the time. Everyone who worked there knew him. We didn't always do what he didn't always completely agree with what we did, but we all still valued his input and everything. So.
Well, thank you guys for coming. David, thank you for taking time out of your college schedule.